Our second speaker for the lightning talk is Toumas Sandholm from CMU. He's going to talk about steering evolution with some computational strategy.
Okay, and do you know how this turns on? I'm in the computer science department, so I don't know how to turn this on. Perfect. Okay, yeah, so I'm Toumas Sandholm. I'll talk about steering biological adaptation and evolution strategically, and this is joint work with, or different parts of this are joint work with a bunch of different collaborators and students. I'll just give an overview because it's just 7 minutes, and this is something we've been doing about 3.5 years now. So the vision is that living organisms evolve or adapt to challenges, and this is a key difficulty in developing therapies, since the challenged organisms develop resistance and push back. The idea is that we're going to harness evolution and adaptation strategically for therapeutic or technological goals. I'll tell you what strategic means here, which is that we are going to model this as a two-player zero-sum incomplete information game in sequence form. So a sequential game, not like Go or chess, but an imperfect information game, much like poker, where the players don't know the full state when they have to decide what to do. And we're going to compute a strategy, which is a contingent plan for the specific game at hand. So there's been actually a huge amount of progress in solving games of imperfect information in the last 14 years. You can see the years on the x-axis, and on the y-axis you can see the scale of how many different states. So this is a good time to do this. And just last year we actually beat the best humans at Heads Up No Limit Texas Hold'em, which is a game with 10 to the power of 161 different situations. So that's a pretty decent sized game, and with that we think that we can take on a bunch of different applications. And of course the techniques are application independent, so they're not poker related techniques. Here's a framework. So we take the original game, then we run an automated abstraction algorithm to get a smaller game. Then we run an equilibrium finding algorithm to find a Nash equilibrium in that game, and then we map the answer back to the original game. And of course, there are dozens and dozens of papers how to do this, so I'm going to skip over all of that. So that's paradigm one, full-blown kind of assuming the opponent is rational. And this is nice in that it doesn't need a probabilistic model of the biological opponent that's being steered. It's also safe in that if the biological opponent doesn't do what's worst for us, that's just going to help us. And the downside is that it's sometimes too conservative to assume that the opponent is going to do the worst thing. And that brings us to the second approach, which is opponent modeling and exploitation. So now we're trying to figure out what are the weaknesses in the opponent. And we're actually doing this currently with deep reinforcement learning techniques. We've also used MCTS in a previous paper and so on. Another approach therein is to start playing game theoretically and then adjust your strategy to take more advantage of the opponent as you get more experience with the opponent. So there are ways to hybridize these, and you could also hybridize by saying, okay, in parts of the state space where you have a lot of data, you use this, and in parts where you don't, you use the game theoretic worst case assumption. And you can actually do safe opponent exploitation to a limited extent, but more than the game theoretic approach. So that's paradigm two. And paradigm three is that evolution and biological adaptation are myopic. They don't look ahead. So we can actually compute these strategies that lead them to play into traps in the state space. So we can design these traps, and it doesn't have to be one trap, like if you want a heterogeneous cancer population to leave no persisters, you want to make sure that at least one trap is something that everybody falls in. Or everybody falls into at least one trap, not that one trap is such that everybody falls in. Okay, so that's it. The idea of the potential benefits is that most medical treatment today is myopic, so it puts a treater at the same downside that the opponent has, which is myopia. Algorithms can often solve games better than humans. We've already seen this in poker in the large. The speed and automation allows you to make custom plans for segments or maybe even individuals. And there's some potential to guide medical research as well, as I'll say so far. So that's a high-level vision. Let's talk about some potential applications and one that we're already doing. So battling disease within an individual patient. So here, the opponent is the disease. For example, let's say a virus. Opponent's actions could include evolving the virus pool within the patient, and the treater's actions could include treatments and then measurements, and based on those you decide what to do next. And in the very long run, you could even think about putting in de novo drug design as part of the action space. And we have some thoughts how to do that. Then you could do this at the population level, like fighting a pandemic. And here's something that we're already published on, which is steering a patient's own immune system. So here the opponent is the patient's own T-cell population. And we're using this to try to fight cancers and autoimmune diseases and infections. So far we're doing this in silico using T-cell models developed by immunologists. And we're using actions that are fairly easy to take and measurements that are fairly easy to measure. There's kind of an interesting trade-off. The bigger the action space and measurement space, the more power you have, but the more complex the planning problem is and the more expensive the treatments are to execute. There's kind of a neat aspect of this also in terms of generating more knowledge into these models. So normally these models are developed in the wet lab, basically like one edge of the signaling pathway at a time, or signaling network at a time. And here it's kind of a new way of kicking the tires of these models in that we're seeing whether there are sequential treatments that work in silico actually work in, let's say, mouse cell culture or actually a live mouse. So then if it doesn't, we know that there's something wrong with the model, and it's a different way of kicking the tires of the model. So we're interested in figuring out how do we actually use that to decide how to change the model, how to enrich the model, which experiments to run next. And there's actually a relationship to causal discovery of these networks and also experimental design. Wild future directions, cell repurposing, synthetic biology, without introducing foreign genetic material. And then you could ask, with this framework, you can formalize and maybe answer fundamental questions in natural science, like can a certain kind of cell be transformed into a certain other kind of cell using evolutionary pressures, using a given set of manipulations? Is it even possible in principle? How much more power do multi-step plans have than single-step plans? So how much of a loss are we taking by focusing on these single-step treatments today? Or does there exist a strategy that will destroy a given diverse cell population like a cancer in a way that leaves no persisters? So can we trap all of them? And what's inherently impossible to achieve via evolution or adaptation? Thank you.
Are there any questions?
When you have like biological networks, for example, what the network means and what the connections mean is much more imprecise than, for example, for poker, where you maybe in the game have like all the possibilities. How can you deal with that? Like sometimes it's very strong protein interactions or modulation, sometimes it's weak.
Yeah. So that actually is happening. That's a good question. I get that a lot when we're taking this to many applications, not just biology, and we're doing that. I always get that question. So the short answer is that we'll see. But the longer answer is that here, as we compute the plans of the model isn't the reality. If the plans then don't work on the real mouse, they work here because they've been tuned to this. If they don't work on the real mouse or cell population, then we need to change this model. How do we go back and change? That's kind of an open research question because it's a new way of kicking the tires of the model. So how do we change? How do we come up with causal things in here instead of just correlational machine learning? And what experiments do we run next then to actually refine this further with this new type of query in active learning, which is this sequential plan query? We do have some papers on game abstraction with bounds where we can prove that if your game model, the abstraction of the reality, is not too far from reality, so you can bound the probabilities, bound the payoff errors, then the strategy that you get from computing the best strategy here is probably not too far from optimal in the real world. But that's kind of theoretical. The more practical thing is that we're going to see experimentally how this goes.
there any more questions?
Yeah.
I'm very intrigued by what you said that evolution is myopic. So I'm just thinking about it, maybe for each cell is myopic, but if there are so many myopic cells simultaneously, would the collection still be myopic?
I think it's still myopic. It's highly parallel though, so that's why this multi-trapping idea in that thread. Yeah, so we're...
strategy to try to trap it into...
That try is the right word, yes. We can devise a strategy to try to trap it. Whether it'll actually work on real cells, we'll see. Yeah.
Okay, with that, let's thank the speaker again.